Okay, now we're going to talk about the termination provisions. You've heard me mention these O sections throughout the tutorials, and a lot of times when something is pursuant to one of these sections, you have to make sure you understand which section it's referring to because they all mean something completely different. There might be not that many sections, but there are some sections in the contract that go back to O-1 of the termination provision. One of those sections is F3. What this is termination due to default. So just kind of go through this and read it, but anytime that there's something in the contract that's subject to this section, it's going to be due to default, not being the fault of the other party. So anyway, one of those sections would be F3, which is the closing date. If someone were not able to meet the closing date and it was pretty much due to default, then that termination O-1 would apply. So see how section F3 talks about section O-1. It says here, trying to find the beginning of the sentence. Thereafter, time shall be of the essence, and if a party fails to perform by the extended scheduled closing date, such party shall be considered in default, and the other party may elect to terminate this purchase contract pursuant to O-1 of the contract. Typically, O-1 is in default, and then deposits are typically at risk. But what you just want to make certain of is that anytime someone is subject to O-1, then it's due to default of the contract and not really has anything to do with the time frame involved in it. This one particularly does because it is a closing date. Okay, so now we're going to move on to O-2 of the purchase contract. Sorry, yeah, O-2, which is termination within a time frame. So let's go back there. Termination within contingency time period. This is where you will see where you're able to cancel, but you would need to do it within a contingency time period. So remember we were talking about J1 where it's like 14 days from acceptance, and I was explaining to you that J1 is subject to O2 of the termination provision O2 of the contract, which means that should your client choose to cancel, they would need to do it within that time frame. So again, like you have 15 days from acceptance, it's March 1st, March 15th would be the deadline. You would need to cancel or terminate prior to that expiration. And that's what O2 talks about. When we're talking about O3, it's a termination provision after the contingency time frame has passed. That section, a good one to talk about would be H1, which is the verification of the cash funds, whereby if the buyer fails to provide such evidence within this period of time, seller may elect to terminate the contract pursuant to O3. So therefore, if you don't receive the verification of cash funds within this time frame can pass and seller would still be able to cancel on the buyer within a period of time after that deadline has passed. And that's what O3 stands for, is the termination for after a contingency has passed. So see how here it says 5 days. So the seller would have 5 days after the failure of the buyer to provide verifications has passed. So you would give him the period of time to do it, but if he doesn't do it within that time frame, you still have 5 more days to cancel after that period is passed. So that's a really good example for O3. Okay, then we talk about O4 through O8, which are just specific terminologies for what happens if things are canceled or people cancel each other, or there's a dispute or a claim that arises during the transaction. That O4 would talk about mediation, where theoretically if a buyer and seller have a dispute of some sort, and then instead of going to court over it and hiring attorneys and costing thousands of dollars, that they do agree to mediate prior to going to that level. If they are unable to reach an agreement of sort, then the next phase would be arbitration. So we're pretty much trying to explain to a potential buyer and seller that if something happens between all of us, that we agree to try to work this out through our board of realtors, rather than going to court and spending thousands of dollars to do that with attorney fees and things like that. They are agreeing to do this just by simply this paragraph being here. So there's no days involved or anything that needs to be signed or checked. It's just a simple part of the contract. And again, there's a few more sections here to be looked at. I'm not going to cover them, but it would behoove you to just read through these things and become familiar with them. Okay, so moving along to page 12, and we talk about disclosure of FERPTA HARPTA. So you should all know by now what HARPTA means and what FERPTA means, and this just kind of describes it a little bit further here. And their disclosures, and that's pretty much all that it is just reminding individuals that are selling and buying that, for example, if you did have a foreign investor who's about ready to sign a purchase contract to sell his house, this is a huge red flag to somebody if they do qualify or are subject to HARPTA or FERPTA, that it is possible that while they're trying to sell their house, now they've got this offer, they go, well, what is HARPTA and FERPTA? And then this would actually bring it to light where maybe they didn't know about it before, which shame on you if you're representing a seller. You should definitely be telling your sellers, about FERPTA HARPTA. But sometimes when they get to this point, a seller receives a contract for the sale of their house and they get to this section, it's brought to their attention that if they are subject to these things, that it's a good idea to investigate it further before signing on the dotted line to sell your home, because maybe this will affect the bottom line and you may not want to do that. Obviously, you don't want to get here and have this happen. So definitely tell your sellers about this way ahead of time. Make sure that they are aware that they're subject to this at the get-go of a listing, rather than have them find out about it later during negotiations with the buyer. Okay, so moving forward to the Q section here. The Q section is a free-for-all of anything that's not already written into the contract that you want to make part of the contract. So maybe there's something in here that's not written that you would really like to add to the contracts. Things like appraisal information, like if it doesn't appraise, the buyer agrees to come up with the balance, yada yada. This is the section where you would add in. So for example, we have for a sample here, Q1 we've added here. It says please number Q1, Q2, and so on and so forth. So we have Q1, buyer and seller agree that this sale is being sold furnished and is subject to E3 of the contract. So just we're putting in here that something that has to do with it being furnished. We just want to make sure that it's absolutely clear. We've added some additional language that isn't already in the contract that we feel needs to be. Q2, another sample would be, like I mentioned when we were talking about the cleaning, that should seller not have the cleaning done by the final walkthrough, seller agrees to credit buyer, and then of course 0, you would put in the amount like $550 or whatever at cleaning for cleaning costs. Other things to consider are the appraisal language. Maybe if it has a boat dock, you want to have something in writing that that boat dock belongs to that property. Parking stalls, asking a seller to provide proof of parking stall information within so many days. There's a lot of things that you can put in here, but this of course is the section that you would utilize for anything that's not already written into the contract that you want to be a part of the contract. So you can do a whole bunch of things here, but this whole section, and that's what that's for, and that's why there's several different lines here for all of that. And then of course, scope of services, disclaimer by brokerage firms. This is something that you see just pretty much giving a buyer and seller the scope of our services, a disclaimer of sort that we're only responsible for what we put out there. And you might just want to kind of read over it just to become familiar with it, but that's just a simple disclaimer. R2, and I think we're going to talk about this in the next section. So again, we're going to next talk about section R through T3 in the next tutorial.